One of the most common ways to space apart elements is using flex gap. It creates even space between each of the elements, but sometimes we want two elements to be closer together than the rest. To do that, we need to wrap them together in their own div, and we can give that div a similar flex direction, similar alignment, and whatever gap we want to pull them closer together. Now, if we want this subheading here to be a little bit closer to the heading, but not as close as the paragraph, we would need to wrap this subheading together in a div with this content block. And if we need to change our text alignment to center, maybe on mobile or a different instance, we now need to change both text alignment and flex alignment on this parent. We need to change flex alignment on this child, and we need to change flex alignment on this button wrap for when they stack under each other on mobile. Instead of using Flexbox, we can space apart elements using margin. This allows us to have custom spacing between each of our elements and create that spacing with less divs. I've even created a class called block gap that allows us to have gap-like behavior on a display block element. That means to change our alignment, we only need to change text alignment on this parent and everything updates. If we head to mobile where these buttons stack under each other, we'll notice their alignment is completely linked to the text alignment on the parent. When we have two elements both set to inline block, they stack next to each other. And by default, their alignment is baseline. So the bottom of this element is aligning to the baseline of the text. We can change this to align to the top of the element next to it, to the bottom, or to the middle, like so. And this works even if the element is set to inline flex or inline grid. Now, what if we want one rim gap between each of these buttons? We can start by giving them some margin of 0.5 rim on all sides, so that when the margin of this element and the element next to it combine, we have one rim gap here in the middle. Now we want these buttons to align to the edge of their content. So we'll select the div that holds them and give it a class of uBlockGap, and we'll give this some margin left of negative 0.5 rim to pull it over by the correct amount. We'll give it some margin right of negative 0.5 rim, and that's making this div wider than its parent. So no matter the alignment we set on this parent, the buttons will always align to the edge. Now, one issue we're having here is this block gap is taller than the buttons because of this bottom margin on the buttons here. And one thing we could try to do is give this block gap some negative top and bottom margin. But what if we have elements above or below this that we need to push apart with positive margin? Well, we're stuck because we're already using this negative margin here. So what we want to do instead of that is we'll go ahead and remove this negative bottom margin. We'll select the buttons. We'll remove their bottom margin and only apply top margin of one rim. So now at least we only have the extra space on the top that we need to get rid of. But one way we can get rid of this is by adding in a div, moving it up here to the top. I'll give this div a class of before, and I'll go ahead and give it a height of 0 pixels. And I want to pull this down into the top margin of one rim that's on these elements. So I'll select this before div, and I'll give it some bottom margin of negative 1 rim. Now, usually it would pull this element down, but because it's butting up against the top of this parent, it's instead pulling the entire parent up. And if you've ever run into an issue with negative margins on a child pulling a parent up, you know this is quite a common issue. So there's a couple ways to get rid of it. One way to do that is to set overflow hidden on the parent, and it removes that issue. But what if our buttons have drop shadows or we need some overflowing content inside here? That might not be the best idea. We could also apply top border if we want, and that also removes the issue of overflowing margins. If I just put 1 pixel top border, then we have that set there. Or another way to solve it is with top padding. If I put this 1 pixel top padding, it effectively separates this child from the edge of its parent, and that margin no longer pulls the parent up. So that's one way we can handle it. I don't like the idea of having a pixel of padding, even though most people will never see it here. So instead, we can use fractions. I can go as far as 0.01 pixel, and that's enough to keep it separated. If I add an extra 0 in here, Webflow won't like that, and it'll actually start allowing the parent to pull up again, which isn't what we want. So we'll do negative 0.1. And also, just in case this div is empty, let's go ahead and empty it out for a minute here and say we have maybe an element below our block gap. It would be pulling this element up below it, which is not what we want. So if we give this some bottom padding of 0.01 pixel, it'll allow it to not pull the element below it up either. So that's what we're going to want to do. we'll just go ahead and give this a matching bottom padding. So no one should ever notice this top and bottom padding, but it's just enough to keep these elements apart. Now we don't want to have to manually add this margin to each child we add in here. And we also don't want to have to manually add this before div. So let's delete this before element, and we'll also delete this top margin and left and right margin on these buttons. And let's head over to our embed, and we'll go ahead and target that uBlockGap class, and we'll select its direct children. And let's give them some margin inline, which is margin left and right of 0.5 rem. We'll also give them some margin top of 1 rem, and that should space apart the buttons. And now we can target that same uBlockGap element, and this time we want to target its before element, which is almost like a hidden div as the first child of any element. We can target that before element. We can go ahead and set its content to empty to get it to show up. And let's also set its display to block because its default is inline. We want it to span the full width. And let's give it some margin bottom of -1 rem to pull basically the children below it up. And so now when we do that, this is hugging the content. Now, one thing we might want to do is set the vertical alignment on each child. So we could set this button to align middle, and then this one over here, we could set to align middle as well. But what if instead of having to adjust each child, we could just adjust the parent? Well, let's set this child to vertical align inherit. So it just inherits from its parent's vertical alignment. And on this one, let's set the same thing. We go ahead and say vertical align inherit, and that's just setting this to inherit. Now, vertical alignment only affects inline elements. So if we apply a vertical align on this block element, it won't affect this element itself. But since the children are inheriting from its parent's vertical align, we could set this to top, and all of the children are at top. We could set it to bottom, it aligns all of them to bottom, or middle like so. Now, instead of having to manually apply this vertical line inherit to each child we might possibly drop in here, what we can do is just head back to our embed where we're selecting all children of the block gap and set their vertical align to inherit. And that way, any child we drop in here will just naturally receive from its parent's alignment. We may also want to easily change the gap on both the X and Y directions. So let's head over to our embed and we'll target that uBlockGap element, and we'll go ahead and create two variables on it. We'll create one called gapX for our horizontal gap. I'll set that to 1 rem for now, and another called gapY for our vertical gap. We'll set that to 1 rem as well. So for the left and right margin on each button here, we want that to be half of our gap X. So we'll go ahead and plug in a calc here, and we'll say var gap X, and we'll say times 0.5. So we're just taking half of that gap X. And then for this margin top, we want to use the gap Y. So we'll go ahead and plug our var gap Y like so. And for this negative margin on this before element, we want to use the gap Y, but we want to make it negative. So we'll go ahead and plug gap Y, and we want to add that into a calc like so. And we'll say gap Y times -1, and that way it just makes this gap Y negative. And one thing else we'll want to do is on this block gap, this left and right margin, we want to go custom. It needs to be half of the gap X, and it also needs to be negative. So if we head over to our calc here, we'll say var, we'll say gap X, and we'll say times -0.5. And that should just make it half of the gap X and make it negative. And we'll do the same thing on the other side, custom right here. So that means we can plug any value we want onto this sort of gap here. And one way we can do that is by going ahead and converting it over to a custom element. And that allows us to have the style attribute on here. So if I say style, I can say gap X, and I can go ahead and make that something like 0.5 if I want to make that smaller. And I can say gap Y, and I can make that something like, I don't know, we'll go 0.2 rem. And we can adjust those two independently on this element here. Now, one thing I would love for us to be able to do is adjust it from custom properties. If Webflow would allow us to define gap X and gap Y right here, then we could adjust that across different breakpoints, have it saved into the class whenever we apply this class. At the time of making this video, that is not an option here. So there is another way we can handle that, and that is through utility classes. So if we want to easily just set different gap values, I can create a couple of different utilities like ugap row small, and I can use that to define any variable I want. So maybe set gap y to be a smaller value here. And then I could just create that for each of the possible different sizes. I could have a medium and set that here. So this is one thing I've done in my framework is just create a couple different gap utilities that I can just apply to this gap here to define any value I want. Now, one other thing I'll do is just create a main gap in case I want to easily adjust both X and Y. I'll set that to 1 rem here by default, and I'll go ahead and connect gap X to be the main gap variable by default. So I'll go ahead and plug that in right here. And that means if we don't define a gap X or a gap Y, it'll naturally just fall back to our main gap. So if we go ahead and save that, now if we want it to adjust both directions, all we would need to do is go ahead and define gap, and we could set that to 0.5 rem or whatever value we want. I could say 0.8, and it's going to adjust both X and Y together. And then I could still adjust just the Y independently if I needed to. I could say 2 rem, and that'll space them further apart there. So now we have a way to adjust both of them or just one individually. Now to actually use this in practice, we would start with a custom class, like maybe something like hero button wrap, and then we would apply our uBlock gap utility on top. And that way we can apply any overrides we want and only have it affect instances of the hero button wrap, like a custom top margin, maybe a custom vertical alignment, or anything else we want. Now what's great about margins is margins collapse into each other. So here we have 1.2 rem bottom margin on this heading, and we also have 0.6 rem top margin on this paragraph, and the margins are just overlapping each other. So if we were to duplicate this paragraph, our two paragraphs are closer together than they are to the heading. To create the same layout with Flexbox, the two paragraphs would have to be wrapped together in a div. Then the div that holds the paragraphs would have to be wrapped with a heading, and we'd have a lot of unneeded divs just to make this simple layout here. So the bottom margin on this paragraph is being overlapped by the top margin on this button wrap here. Now, one disadvantage to Flexbox is when we start hiding different elements here, we're left with some unwanted bottom or top margin in many cases. I originally had a margin trim class we could apply to any parent to remove the top margin from its first child and the bottom margin from its last child. But that got pretty tedious to have to keep applying that margin trim class. So what I found worked better instead was to have that automatically applied. So every element will have its first child have no top margin, and for every element, its last child will have no bottom margin. And I've created a class we could use to turn off that behavior called uMarginTrimOff. And I'm also excluding that behavior from the uBlock gap since we want those margins on those buttons. But if we go ahead and save that here, we'll notice that the bottom margin is automatically removed from this paragraph here. And this heading has both bottom and top margin. But if we go ahead and hide this eyebrow here, we'll notice the top margin is automatically removed from the heading. So this is working very similar to gap in that the space is only being applied in between the elements here. And we can have very dynamic layouts without needing extra divs here. One thing we'll notice is if we wrap this heading in a div, its margin is automatically removed because it's both the first and last child of this div. If we want to bring that margin back in, we can go ahead and say uMarginTrimOff, and that will enable the top and bottom margins on the first and last childs inside of this div only if we want. So we can always enable that behavior on any parent that we want, but by default, it's going to work just like FlexGap would and only add space between individual elements. Often we'll need to set a max width on our text element to keep the text from getting too wide. Now, when we do that, what we'll notice if we set our text alignment on this parent to center, this element isn't moving to the center. One way we can fix that is by setting it to inline block. But now we'll notice our spacing here changed because overlapping margins only overlap on block, flex, or grid elements. They don't overlap on inline elements. And another issue we can run into with inline elements is if our space is wide enough or our max width is small enough, we'll notice this heading and paragraph stack side by side because inline elements, of course, go side by side. So we don't actually want to do that. One way we can avoid this is by not applying the inline block and max width directly to the text style element. Instead, what we'll do is basically we can wrap this paragraph in a div, and we can give this child a class of inline block and maybe a max width of whatever we want here. And then we can apply the font size to the parent div. And we'll talk about how to get the child to inherit from the parent's font style. But because this parent div is set to block, its margins will overlap. And because the inline element is wrapped in a block div, we never had to worry about it stacking side by side with another inline element. So that means if we basically were to text align left this or any direction, we'll notice our max width inside is contained within that parent. Now, this can actually work out to our advantage because often we'll use rich text so we can have links or bold or italic text inside. And a rich text is just a div with a paragraph inside it. So this is the exact structure we already need. Now, on this div, we can't actually select the paragraph inside and give it this inline block, give it this max width. So instead, what we can do is create a class like uChildContain on this parent element, which is the rich text. And we'll want to say whenever there's a direct child of this uChildContain, we want to give it some styles. So I'll go ahead and open up this embed. And let's say our uChildContain class, uChildContain, we want to select the direct child, whatever that is, and we want to set it to display of inline block, and we want to give it a max width of inherit. So it just inherits from whatever max width we put on the parent. So if we save that and I go ahead and open this component, we'll notice, let's go ahead and duplicate this rich text. Let's go ahead and detach its content for a minute so we can see the text inside. What we'll notice is this paragraph inside is set to inline block, where paragraphs normally not inside would not be set to inline block, but this one is because it's inside of our uChildContain here. Now, if we were to set a max width on this parent element, like let's go 36ch, we'll notice that the child inside is going to inherit its parent's max width here, but we still run into the same issue if we text align this, where this parent is not centering because it's a block element with a max width. So all we need to do to fix that is give this uChildContain a minimum width of 100%. And min width always wins out over max width. So if the min width is greater, that's what will apply. So this parent will always have a full width of 100% of its parent. And it has this max width, which really isn't doing anything at all on the parent. But since the child inside is inheriting from its parent's max width, the child is getting whatever max width we set here. So if I want the text inside this rich text to have a tighter max width, all I had to do is tighten up the max width on this parent, and the child is just receiving from that parent's max width. So I can really set that to whatever I want here. So now that we have that set and good to go, we have centered aligned text, and we don't have to just use this on a rich text element. We could totally use this class on a regular div as well. So instead of needing to manually apply this child class with this inline block and max width, I can just go ahead on this parent element and apply that uChildContain class. And that way it gets the child automatically gets the inline block and max width when it's inside of this parent. So if I try to apply a class like uTextStyleSmall to this div here, the paragraph inside won't actually get that style because the paragraph tag, of course, has its own sort of font styles applied. Same thing if we were to apply a text style display or H1 to the parent of this H2, it wouldn't work because the H2 tag has its own sort of styling here. So all of our classes start with u-text-style, and then it's display, H2, small for our small paragraph. So they all follow the same convention here. So one thing I could do is I could say for any element that starts or has a class containing u-text-style. So if we add a display extra large or a text tiny to this later on, as long as it follows the same naming convention, this will apply to those new text styles. So we're going to select their direct children, and we'll set all of their font styles to inherit from the parent. So its family, its size, its weight, line height, letter spacing, text transform, all of this just inherits from the parent. So that means if we have on the parent of this paragraph a text style of small, it'll just receive from this child inside will receive from its parent. So that means on this rich text element here, even though it's a paragraph inside it that has its own styles, I can apply a uText style of H2 and it will make the paragraph inside look like the H2, like so. So we can really control all of those styles from the parent. So to put this all into practice in real life, I might have a rich text element with an H1 inside. I would start by giving it a custom class like hero title, and then I would give it whatever font style I want. In this case, I want it to look like an H2, even though it's actually an H1 inside. And then I could give it my child contain class, so that way I can put whatever max width I want on this here, and it's going to affect the text inside. And now I have everything I need for this component. One thing we often need to do is give our container a min height and vertically center the content inside. We could apply Flexbox, change the direction, and change our alignment like so, but whenever margins are inside of a flex parent, the margins no longer overlap here. So one thing we could do to fix that is wrap these together in a div, and that div would be display block, and we'd just be vertically centering that div with the parent like so. But if we want to avoid using an extra div and still have our collapsing margins work, what we can do instead is remove the Flexbox from this parent, and we can use some Flexbox styles on a display block div. And not many people know this. So on this display block div under custom properties, we can add align content, and we can say center, and that'll put it right there in the middle. We could say start, and that'll put it at the beginning, or we could say end to align it to the bottom. So we have all of these options here, and this way we can keep our overlapping margins because this is a block div. And of course, on the same container, we can do text alignment to center or left align, or set this however we want. And when the buttons wrap under each other, it's still respecting our alignment like so. Now, one thing we might want to do to polish up our selector a little bit, right now this is targeting all direct children inside of our text element, but if we have a bold or italic text that we want to style a bit differently, we don't want those elements to lose their styles. So we can just upgrade the selector a little bit and only target H1s through H6 paragraph and block quotes that are inside of our text style, and only these elements will lose their initial styles. And so that's a high-level overview of how to handle alignment and spacing in a bit of a different way. I'll leave a link to this clonable in the description below.